The supply closet at Oak Creek Memorial smelled like antiseptic and broken promises. Ashley Cooper moved through the shelves at 6:13 a.m., her hands making quick work of inventory, saline bags, for catheters, wound dressing kits, each item counted, logged, verified. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song overhead, casting everything in that particular hospital white that made the world feel both sterile and somehow more fragile. She wore blue scrubs with the hospital logo faded from 100 washings, her name badge clipped to her pocket reading simply Cooper. That was all the name Savannah needed to know. Her movements carried the kind of efficiency that came from operating under fire, though nobody here knew that. 6 years in Special Forces. 3 tours to Baghdad. The precision in her inventory counts matched supply manifests to the decimal point because human error in medical settings got people killed, and Ashley Cooper had spent enough time watching people die. She'd learned to move like she was invisible, shoulders slightly hunched, dark circles under her eyes from a sleep disorder no VA therapist could quite fix. When her scrub sleeves rode up as she reached for the higher shelves, the scars on her forearms caught the light, thin white lines tracing patterns that matched shrapnel from an IED detonation in Fallujah, March 2019. She pulled her sleeves down without thinking. An old habit. The cardiac wing of Oak Creek Memorial sprawled across the 3rd floor in a careful geometry of patient rooms and monitoring stations. Ashley had worked here for 2 years under the name Ashley Cooper, which was technically accurate, Cooper being her married name from a marriage that hadn't survived her first redeployment. The name was a shield. Nobody asked questions about a surname that told no story. Nobody looked too closely at the woman who arrived 40 minutes early, completed her charting with obsessive precision, and left exactly on schedule without socializing in the break room. Her presence was the medical equivalent of a ghost, essential, efficient, utterly forgettable. At 6:52 a.m., Marcus Chen arrived in room 312 on a stretcher pushed by orderlies who moved with practiced indifference. 58 years old, broad-shouldered despite the hollow look in his eyes, wearing hospital-standard gown and an expression that suggested he'd seen worse than cardiac surgery waiting lists. The surgical wound on his left chest ran for inches down his sternum, post-operative stitches still pink and slightly inflamed. The file clipped to the foot of his bed indicated he'd been in-house for 72 hours following routine bypass grafting. What the file didn't indicate was that the man had once carried a woman through 3 miles of Baghdad streets with a collapsed lung while taking sniper fire. He'd never mentioned her name to anyone. He carried her name tattooed on his left forearm instead, the letters running from shoulder to wrist in a style that looked like it had been done by someone who knew what they were doing. Ashley entered room 312 at 7:08 a.m. to assess the surgical site and redress the wound. Marcus looked at her face for exactly 2 seconds, then away. His eyes held the kind of polite distance that came from seeing someone and finding them unremarkable. He saw a woman in her mid-40s with an exhausted expression and efficient hands. What he didn't see, what nobody at Oak Creek Memorial saw, was that the hands moving across his chest had once held a 40mm grenade launcher with the grip of someone who'd qualified expert level. The tattoo on his arm showed her face as it had been 10 years younger, before the PTSD started stealing her sleep. Before she'd changed her name. Before she'd walked away from the Navy entirely and decided Savannah seemed like a place where nobody would know what she used to be. Pain level today, Mr. Chen? 1 through 10, Ashley asked, her voice steady and blank as water. The question came out the way every question came out, professional, detached, filtered through the careful distance she maintained from every patient. 3. Maybe 4 when I move, he answered, his eyes fixed on the ceiling tiles. His voice carried the flat effect of someone who'd learned to describe their injuries with the emotional range of a weather report. She changed the dressing with movements so practiced they looked choreographed. The old gauze came away slowly. The wound underneath looked clean, minimal inflammation, stitches holding. Her hands moved like they were reading Braille, checking for heat, for swelling, for any sign of infection. Pain was information. She'd learned that in Baghdad. Every bit of sensory data meant something. She taped the new dressing down with the kind of precision that made the action look less like nursing and more like a ritual. Doctor will check it again tomorrow, Ashley said, turning toward the door. Press the call button if the pain increases. Marcus nodded without looking at her. He'd already forgotten her face. But that wasn't the worst part. Dr. Hargrove stood in the doorway of the monitoring station at 7:16 a.m., watching Ashley move between patient rooms with the kind of sustained attention that felt almost predatory. He was 54 years old, with the kind of expensive haircut that suggested someone else paid attention to his appearance, and a manner that made people want to please him. His tie cost more than Ashley's monthly rent. His watch cost more than her car. He'd been practicing cardiothoracic medicine for 23 years and had never once been told no by an institution that mattered. But in the last 3 months, something had shifted. Something had started to unravel. 3 months ago, Ashley Cooper had noticed something while processing a shipment of surgical equipment from Medtronic. The invoice listed 48 arterial cannulas at $847 each. The physical count showed 34. She'd mentioned it casually to Hargrove during morning rounds. "Just double-checking the numbers, doctor. Might be a shipping error." Her tone had been deferential, careful, offering him an out. Most people would have appreciated that. Most people would have said thank you and investigated. Hargrove had said nothing and changed the subject. But he'd remembered. Since then, Ashley had started documenting everything. Not in a confrontational way, she wasn't stupid. She simply did her job with a kind of meticulous precision that created a paper trail. Every supply discrepancy noted in the supply log. Every medication count verified against the pharmacy manifest. Every patient outcome documented with obsessive detail. The kind of charting that couldn't be ignored if anyone ever actually looked at it. And Hargrove could feel her watching him. Could feel her attentiveness in the way she counted instruments before and after procedures, the way she cross-referenced inventory against billing codes. She was a threat without ever doing anything remotely threatening. Just a nurse asking questions. Just a nurse whose name badge said Cooper and whose hands moved with military precision and whose presence in a room seemed to make him feel like he was being audited. The thing was, he was being audited. He'd been skimming from the hospital for 4 years. Small adjustments to billing codes. Supply invoices that got padded by 15% and then split with a medical device rep named Carson who worked for a company called Cardiotech Solutions. $500,000 over 4 years. Not enough to trigger institutional review, but enough to matter. Enough to renovate the beach house. Enough to fund a second mortgage on the condo in Atlanta. Enough to keep him living the way he decided he deserved to live. And this exhausted woman in blue scrubs was going to ruin it if he didn't get ahead of the problem. He made a phone call from his office at 8:11 a.m., after his first patient of the day was already prepped for surgery. The office door closed. The Venetian blind slid shut with a whisper of plastic. His voice came through low and measured, the tone someone used when they wanted to sound concerned about a colleague rather than threatened. "I need you to look into one of our nurses," Hargrove said, his voice smooth as silk. "Ashley Cooper. Works the cardiac wing. I'm getting concerned about some inconsistencies in her documentation. Maybe some medication handling issues. I don't want to accuse anyone of anything, but if there's a problem, we need to know about it before the insurance auditors do. You understand?" The voice on the other end of the line belonged to Margaret Chen, the hospital's director of human resources. She'd worked with Hargrove for 9 years. She owed him favors. They all did. "Of course, doctor," she said. "I'll pull her file. If there's anything." "Just keep it between us for now," Hargrove interrupted. "Discretion. Professional courtesy. We don't want rumors getting started over nothing." The phone clicked off. Hargrove leaned back in his chair, which cost $3,200 and had been justified as a medical necessity for his posture. Through his office window, he could see the surgical wing beyond the glass, where people in blue and green were preparing for the procedures that made him invaluable. Irreplaceable. Above question. He didn't see what Ashley was doing in the supply closet at that exact moment. Counting. Always counting. Cross-referencing billing codes from 3 weeks ago against the actual equipment on hand. Finding another discrepancy. 40 units of 8.0 endotracheal tubes billed. 32 on the shelf. She added it to her notebook, a simple composition book with a black cover, not attached to any official system. Just notes. Just observations. Just the kind of meticulous documentation that had kept her alive in Baghdad and was now going to make someone very uncomfortable in Savannah. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects. Rain began to fall outside, hitting the hospital windows with the sound of static on old television. Ashley stood in the supply closet with her notebook, her hand steady, her mind running calculations that suggested something systematic was happening. Someone was stealing. Someone with access to ordering systems. Someone high enough up that nobody questioned them. She had no idea that she'd just become a problem. She had no idea that by tomorrow, human resources would be reviewing her personnel file. That by next week, Hargrove would have orchestrated her first public humiliation. That by month 3, she'd be drowning in fabricated complaints and manufactured procedure violations. She had no idea that the quiet work she'd always done, the kind of invisible competence that had made her valuable in war and invaluable in medicine, was about to make her dangerous to a man who'd learned that money mattered more than integrity. For now, she simply closed her notebook, shelved it beneath the false bottom of her locker where she kept the pair of worn combat boots caked with Baghdad dust, and went back to work. The morning light filtered through room 312's window in pale, institutional bars. Ashley stood at Marcus Chen's bedside, her gloved hand steady as she peeled away the surgical dressing from his post-operative wound. The stitches were clean, the incision line healing with the precision of a seam, and she knew, because she had studied every detail of his chart through the night, that his vitals had improved by 2% since yesterday. His adult daughter stood near the monitor. His son leaned against the far wall, arms crossed. Marcus watched Ashley work with the quiet attention of someone who had survived by noticing details. She had just applied fresh gauze when the door swung open with the force of someone who needed to announce their arrival before their presence could be questioned. Dr. Hargrove. Tie perfectly knotted. Watch expensive. Jaw set like a man carrying certainty the way other people carried keys. Nurse Cooper, what exactly do you think you're doing? His voice was surgical in its precision, designed to cut, timed to bleed slowly. Ashley looked up calmly. Her hands did not pause. Wound care per protocol, doctor. He crossed the room in 3 strides and plucked the gauze from her fingers with a gesture that bordered on snatching. The movement was quick enough that his urgency felt justified, even though nothing in Ashley's technique had warranted intervention. He held the dressing up to the light as if examining evidence of a crime. This is contaminated technique. Completely improper. His gaze swung toward Marcus's daughter. Did you see? She didn't even. I scrubbed in according to standard sterile protocol, Ashley said quietly. Her voice never rose. It never needed to. According to what, Nurse Cooper? The protocols you seem to think don't apply to you. He turned to the family with an expression of sympathy that looked practiced. I apologize for this. We'll have someone competent finish the dressing change. The room went completely silent except for the heart monitor's steady beeping, a sound like a countdown nobody had started. Marcus's son straightened. His daughter's face flushed with confusion because she had watched Ashley work and seen nothing but expertise. Ashley took one measured breath. She let a single tear escape and wiped it without breaking eye contact. Her voice, when it came, was level as stone. I've carried better men than you'll ever be through worse places than you can imagine, and I've never cut corners on patient care. The silence deepened. Dr. Hargrove's expression flickered, a microsecond of something that might have been uncertainty, before his smile returned, thin and precise. That's insubordination, Cooper. We'll add it to your file. He turned toward the door, already typing something into his phone before his hand touched the frame. Marcus's daughter reached out and squeezed Ashley's arm. No words. The gesture carried everything anyway. 3 days later, Ashley pushed open the break room door at 1:15 p.m. She had timed her lunch break specifically to avoid the busiest shift change, seeking 45 minutes of silence and a turkey sandwich eaten without company. The break room was modest: 2 tables, 6 chairs, a refrigerator that hummed like a small animal in distress, and a microwave that smelled perpetually of reheated fish. 4 nurses occupied the room. Within 30 seconds of Ashley's arrival, all 4 stood simultaneously. One gathered her phone. Another left half her yogurt on the table, abandoned mid-spoonful. They filed out in quick succession, a choreography of rejection that looked almost coordinated. 2 more nurses in the hallway saw them exit together and followed without asking why. The whispers trailed behind them like smoke. Incompetent. Liability. Dangerous. Ashley set her tray down at the empty table nearest the window. The fluorescent lights above buzzed with the particular weariness of fixtures that had been burning for too long. She sat in a room designed for community and became its only occupant. A resident glanced in, made eye contact for precisely 1 second, and disappeared. She ate methodically. Turkey. Wheat bread. Mustard. Her hands held the fork with complete steadiness. She did not look toward the doorway. She did not check her phone. She did not permit her breathing to change. This was a skill she had perfected over 13 years, the ability to accept isolation as simply another environmental condition, like temperature or humidity. She had sat in convoy trucks while mortars fell 300 meters away. She had held pressure on wounds in complete darkness. She could certainly hold her jaw level while eating alone under fluorescent lights. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part happened the next morning at 7 a.m. during shift change, when the entire nursing station was crowded. 15 staff members clustered around medication dispensers, checking schedules, comparing notes on overnight admissions. The fluorescent panels overhead cast everything in the quality of bad theater lighting. And Dr. Hargrove walked to the announcement board, the one usually reserved for schedule changes and staff birthdays, and he posted something new. He posted it where everyone could see. The paper was official hospital letterhead. His signature was at the bottom, crisp and authoritative. The title read, Staff Counseling Notice, Personnel File Entry. Ashley was restocking supplies in the medication cart, exactly 20 feet away, when she heard him begin reading aloud. This is to document a pattern of concerning behavior by Nurse Ashley Cooper. His voice carried across the station with the practiced projection of someone used to being heard. Insubordination. Repeated protocol deviations. Failure to follow chain of command. Questionable judgment regarding patient care decisions. Several nurses studied their shoes. One shifted uncomfortably. One actually turned away. Dr. Hargrove continued reading, his tone conversational, as if discussing something minor. Nurse Cooper, or should I say, Nurse Nobody, seems to believe the rules don't apply to her. He smiled. Several staff members smiled back, a reflex response to authority that looked almost painful on their faces. Ashley stood 3 feet away. Her face was stone. She continued counting gauze packages, her hands moving with precision that would have looked automated if anyone had been paying attention. Which they weren't. They were watching Dr. Hargrove, the man with the tie and the authority and the certainty that filled rooms like weather systems. He finished reading and looked directly at her. Nurse Cooper, do you have anything to say about these documented violations? She met his gaze. Her voice, when it came, was quiet enough that people had to stop moving to hear it. Are you finished, Doctor? Not even close, he replied. And he smiled the way men smile when they are winning something. He walked away, the notice still pinned to the board, visible to every staff member who rotated through the station. Ashley returned to counting gauze packages. Her count was perfect. It was always perfect. That night, in the medication room at 11 p.m., Oak Creek Memorial fell into the quiet hum of overnight operations. Ashley worked alone, cross-referencing billing codes with actual equipment delivered, her shift extended on what appeared to be routine audit. She photographed invoice documents with her personal phone, documenting serial numbers on cardiac stents. The boxes showed wholesale prices of $1,800. The hospital billing codes listed them at $4,200. The discrepancy was neither accidental nor small. She recorded 6 separate items with identical patterns. Then she deleted the photos from her cloud backup and stored them encrypted on an external drive she kept in her car, buried beneath the spare tire alongside something she had never shown anyone, a pair of worn combat boots caked with Baghdad dust, still carrying soil from a place she had carried men from. Her phone buzzed. A message from the VA hospital intake department: "Your appointment is confirmed for tomorrow, 6 p.m. She stared at the notification without opening it. Then she pressed the phone to her chest and allowed herself, for exactly 1 minute, to breathe like someone who was drowning. The medication room at 11 p.m. was quiet in the way that made Ashley's skin itch. Fluorescent panels hummed overhead, casting everything in that institutional white that made blood look grey. She stood at the supply cabinet with a printout in one hand and a delivery manifest in the other, cross-referencing invoice codes against actual equipment received. The discrepancies had started small, a few $100s here, a variance there. But over 3 months, they'd calcified into a pattern she couldn't ignore. Row by row. Item by item. The numbers didn't match. She'd been thorough enough that her own charting created the audit trail. Every code she'd flagged corresponded to equipment she'd physically inventory checked upon arrival. Suture kits marked as delivered, not in storage. Cardiac monitoring cables billed at 3 times market value. Orthopedic implants documented as received but never logged into the system. The pattern was surgical in its precision. Someone had learned to skim between the margins where no one was looking. Ashley's hands went cold. Not from fear. From understanding. Dr. Hargrove had been orchestrating this for years. The invoices always came through his approval signature. The kickbacks would flow through the medical device company, a subsidiary registered in Delaware, far enough removed that only someone actively looking would connect the dots. And he'd been getting away with it because no one had been looking. No one had bothered to count the actual supplies against the billing codes. No one, that is, until a nurse who'd spent 18 years checking ammunition counts and body armor inventory decided to apply the same obsessive precision to Oak Creek Memorial's supply chain. She photographed each discrepancy with her phone. 12 photos. $47,000 in systematic overbilling across just the orthopedic contracts alone. The device company was Mid-Atlantic Biomedical Solutions, a name that meant nothing to most people. To Ashley, it meant one thing: leverage. And leverage meant Hargrove had already calculated what she represented. A threat. The morning shift started at 6 a.m. Ashley arrived at 5:45 the way she always did, moving through the pre-dawn corridors of Oak Creek Memorial like she belonged to the building more than the building belonged to itself. The medication room was restocked. The supply cart was organized. The charts for her assigned patients were prepped. Everything precise. Everything ready. Everything the way Senior Chief Petty Officer Ashley Mendez Cooper had been trained to do it, preparation so thorough that failure became mathematically impossible. At 6:20 a.m., Dr. Hargrove stood in the medication room with his arms crossed. She was preparing a vancomycin drip for room 307 when his voice cut across the space like a scalpel finding scar tissue. "Nurse Cooper, I need you to explain something." The way he said her name, the slight pause, the emphasis on the last syllable, carried a charge that made the 2 other nurses pretend they weren't listening. "Of course, doctor. The narcotics log shows a discrepancy. 100 milliliters of fentanyl checked out under your signature yesterday morning. The documentation doesn't match the actual withdrawal amount." His eyes were calm. Predatory. The eyes of someone who'd already decided how this conversation would end. "How do you explain that?" Ashley didn't move. She'd been trained to recognize an ambush from 300 meters away. Hargrove had just closed the distance to arm's length. "I didn't withdraw fentanyl yesterday," she said. Her voice was level. "I was on nights. Days handled all medication administration. Your signature is on the log. Then someone forged it." The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. In that gap of time, Hargrove smiled. It was the smile of a man who had been waiting for permission to stop restraining himself. "That's an extremely serious accusation, Nurse Cooper. Are you truly claiming that someone forged your signature? That's theft. That's a federal crime you're alleging occurred in this hospital." The other 2 nurses had stopped moving entirely. One of them, Jennifer, who'd worked nights with Ashley for 2 years, had gone very still. Her jaw was working, but no sound came out. "I'm saying the medication is accounted for and my signature on that log doesn't match my actual withdrawals," Ashley said. The words came out flat. Unavoidable. Like reading data from an instrument panel during a mission brief. "What I'm hearing," Hargrove said, stepping closer, his voice dropping to that practiced medical tone that carried weight without ever raising volume, "is that you either stole controlled substances or you're so incompetent that you can't keep track of your own documentation. Either way, Nurse Cooper, that's grounds for immediate suspension and a report to the DEA." He paused. "Let that land. Unless you'd like to reconsider your story." Ashley breathed. One measured breath. In through her nose. Out through her mouth. The kind of breath that came before decisions that changed the shape of everything that followed. She set down the vancomycin preparation kit with precision, the bottles aligned perpendicular to the edge of the work surface. Her hands were steady. Her hands were always steady. And then she let a single tear escape. Not from emotion. From choice. From the understanding that what she was about to say would fracture something between her and the life she'd been building here. The tear tracked down her right cheek without breaking her eye contact. She didn't wipe it away. She let Hargrove see it, and more importantly, she let him see that it didn't break her. "I've carried better men than you'll ever be through worse places than you can imagine," she said. Her voice had changed. It wasn't the careful deferential tone of a nurse responding to a physician. It was the voice of someone speaking from a place that predated this hospital, this city, this identity. It was a voice that had issued commands in languages Hargrove couldn't comprehend, that had spoken last words to dying soldiers in the dark, that had held the weight of decisions that cost lives or saved them. "And I've never taken what wasn't mine. Not once. Not ever." The silence after her words was different from before. It was the silence of a room recognizing, without understanding how, that it had just shifted on its axis. Jennifer's eyes had widened. The other nurse, Marcus, newer to the floor, looked like he'd been slapped. Hargrove's face had gone the particular shade of red that happened when a man realized his script wasn't working the way he'd written it. "That's insubordination," he said. The words came out thin. Desperate. The way a man sounds when he's discovering that the leverage he thought he had was illusory. "I'm documenting this conversation as." "Document whatever you want," Ashley said. She turned back to the vancomycin, her hands already moving to the next step of the preparation. Not dismissive. Not angry. Just done. "The log is falsified and you know it. The medication is accounted for. And we both know why you're building this case." She didn't turn around. Didn't watch his face go from red to something closer to white. Didn't acknowledge the way he left the room 3 seconds later, his footsteps fast enough that they bordered on a walk that wasn't quite dignified. She simply finished the preparation, labeled the 4 bag with the patient's name and the time, and moved forward with the 12-hour shift in front of her. But that wasn't the worst part. By mid-morning, the director of nursing had called an emergency meeting with risk management. By early afternoon, Hargrove had forwarded 17 emails documenting a pattern of alleged protocol violations, half of them dated from the past 2 weeks, all of them conveniently aligned to support a narrative he'd clearly been constructing in parallel. The investigator he'd brought in, a grey-haired woman from some outside firm who asked questions like she already knew the answers, was reviewing personnel files with the focused intensity of someone looking to confirm what they'd been told to find. And at 2 p.m., Ashley was called to the director's office. The director wouldn't look at her. That was the detail that would stay with Ashley longer than the words themselves. Sandra Matthews had worked with her for 2 years. had praised her patient care during evaluations, had nodded in agreement when Ashley suggested protocol improvements. But now, with Hargrove's documentation spread across her desk and the outside investigator sitting in the chair beside her, Sandra couldn't manage eye contact. "We need to place you on immediate administrative suspension pending a formal investigation," Sandra said. The words came out rehearsed. "Your access badges will be deactivated effective immediately. You're not to return to the unit or access any patient information. We'll be forwarding everything to Human Resources and to the State Licensing Board." Ashley stood very still. Her hands were at her sides. Her breathing was controlled. The part of her that had lived through briefings that preceded people dying was observing from a clinical distance, noting details, the way instruments recorded data, the scuff mark on Sandra's left shoe, the way the investigator's pen didn't move even though her eyes were tracking, the sound of the building's ventilation system clicking on in the ductwork above them. "I saved a patient's life last night," Ashley said quietly. "Marcus Chen. Tension pneumothorax. I performed a needle decompression when the resident froze. His O2 was 72%. That's exactly the kind of unauthorized procedure that concerns us," the investigator said. She was reading from notes now, not looking up. "Performing invasive medical procedures without physician authorization. Operating outside your scope of practice. This combined with the documented medication discrepancies and the pattern of—" "There is no pattern," Ashley said. Her voice had dropped. Had become something harder. Something with weight behind it. "There's a falsified log and there's a doctor who's been overbilling for supplies for 4 years. And there's a nurse who found the discrepancies in her charting and now he's building a termination case because he's terrified of what happens when the wrong person looks at the numbers." Sandra's face went white. The investigator's pen finally moved, scribbling something across her notes with the particular intensity of someone documenting an accusation that was either going to solve her case or destroy it. "That's a serious allegation," the investigator said slowly. "It's accurate," Ashley said. She turned toward the door. "I'm done. Suspend me. Report me. Do whatever you calculated you needed to do. But the supply chain fraud is real and you're going to find it whether you're looking for me or not." She left the office before they could respond. Left her badge on Sandra's desk. Left the smell of antiseptic and industrial cleaning solutions that had become the geography of her life for 2 years. Left Oak Creek Memorial moving through the afternoon light like someone who had already trained for losses far greater than this. But in the parking lot, as the rain began to fall on the asphalt like applause from an audience that knew exactly what was about to happen, Ashley had no idea that a helicopter was being fueled 40 miles away. Had no idea that her name had already been run through 3 databases by people in offices without windows. Had no idea that sometimes, when you carry the weight of secrets long enough, the weight itself becomes a beacon visible only to those trained to see it. She sat in her car with the rain hammering the windshield and allowed herself exactly 1 minute to understand that everything she'd built here, the invisibility, the anonymity, the life where no one knew what she'd been, had just come to an end. The code blue alarm screamed through the cardiac wing at 2:11 a.m., a sound that split the silence of Oak Creek Memorial like a blade through silk. Ashley was 3 floors up, finishing her shift notes, when the overhead speaker crackled, "Code blue, cardiac care, Bay 3. Code blue, cardiac care, Bay 3. Her hands moved before her mind caught up, badge clipped, shoes already moving, muscle memory older than her scrubs propelling her toward the stairwell instead of the elevator because stairs were 12 seconds faster than waiting. She hit the 2nd floor running. Bay 3 was chaos wearing the mask of controlled panic. Dr. Raymond Chen's resident, a nervous 2nd year whose name she could never quite remember, was fumbling with an ambu bag while 2 nurses stood frozen, waiting for direction that wasn't coming. The monitors screamed a arrhythmia pattern that made the room feel like it was tilting. And there, on the bed, was Marcus Chen, grey-lipped, gasping, his chest rising asymmetrically, the right side lagging like a broken engine cylinder. His trachea had deviated hard to the left, which meant only one thing. Tension pneumothorax. Collapsed lung. The kind of emergency that killed people in the space between heartbeats if you waited for the imaging to confirm what your eyes already knew. "Step back," Ashley said, not loud, just clear as a firing pin. The resident turned to her with a "what are you doing" expression. She didn't wait for him to answer. She was already moving to the crash cart, already locating what she needed, a 14-gauge angiocath needle, the kind that felt impossibly thin in her hand and impossibly heavy with consequence. The ammonia-bright smell of antiseptic flooded the bay as she tore open the sterile package, her movements the opposite of rushed, deliberate, certain, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. "Hey, you can't just," the resident started. Ashley didn't hear him. Or rather, she heard him the way you hear rain while you're underwater, distant, irrelevant, something happening in a different world. She had Marcus Chen's left side exposed, found the second intercostal space with her fingertips, mid-clavicular line, marked the spot with her practiced eye. The needle went in between his second and third ribs. There was resistance, then the hiss, that specific sound of trapped air escaping, a sound like a tire deflating in fast forward, beautiful and terrible. His oxygen saturation climbed, 68 to 71 to 76 to 82 to 88. His breathing synchronized. His color shifted from ash to human. "Get him to CT," Ashley said to no one and everyone, and the bay suddenly unstuck itself, moving with purpose now, with direction. The second nurse was already coordinating transport. The resident was writing orders. And two nurses who had been frozen moments before stood at the edge of the bay, watching what had just happened, their faces the color of drywall paint. She didn't remember stepping out of the bay. Didn't remember pulling off her gloves or washing her hands at the sink, cold water against her skin, the soap dispenser groaning like a living thing. What she remembered was the way those two nurses were looking at her. Not confused anymore. Something older. Something that looked like recognition. Like they'd just watched someone they'd been sharing a break room with suddenly reveal they were something other than they appeared. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song, indifferent to everything that had just changed. By morning, the cardiac wing hummed with the machinery of routine. Rounds. Charting. The gentle organized chaos of people saving lives in increments. Ashley was writing post-procedure notes when her phone buzzed. A text from the nursing director, "Please report to my office. Now." No emoji. No punctuation ornament. Just the sentence equivalent of a door slamming. The walk to the administrative wing took 90 seconds and felt like 90 miles. The carpet was industrial gray. The walls were the color of hospitals everywhere, a beige that had been chosen by someone whose job was to choose colors that offended no one and inspired nothing. Her badge felt heavier than usual. She thought about the combat boots in her locker, laced and waiting. Thought about how long it would take to fill a cardboard box with 8 years of carefully constructed normal life. The nursing director was not alone. Dr. Hargrove stood by the window, phone pressed to his ear, his other hand gesturing at something only he could see. When she entered, he ended the call with a snap of his fingers and smiled. Not the smile of a man having a good day. The smile of a man who'd just won a war he'd been planning for 3 months. "Ashley," he said, pulling out a folder, "sit down." She didn't sit. "I've been in contact with your previous employers," he continued, his voice moving at a careful pace, words measured like drops of poison in water. "Very interesting conversations. A pattern of concerning behavior. Reckless decision-making. Procedures performed without proper supervision. Your hospital in Charleston mentioned some troubling incidents." None of that was true. Her file there was immaculate. But the lie was being constructed in real time, built from nothing and shaped by 3 phone calls to board members he'd bought drinks for at the country club. 3 calls to whoever still answered when he called. This morning's code blue, the nursing director said quietly, was performed without physician direction. That's protocol violation. That's a scope of practice issue. She saved a man's life, came a voice from the doorway. Dr. Raymond Chen, the actual attending, stood there with his own file in hand. "I was 3 minutes out." She performed a needle decompression that was textbook and necessary. If she hadn't moved, that patient would have coding en route. But Dr. Hargrove was already standing, already pulling out his phone again. I've already contacted an independent investigator. And I've reached out to the board. The board that doesn't know you've been inflating billing codes. Dr. Chen's voice went quiet, which made it somehow more devastating. The board that doesn't know about the kickbacks from Medcore Solutions. The room went dead silent. The kind of silence that comes right before something breaks. I don't know what you're suggesting, Dr. Hargrove said, but his hand had stopped moving. His jaw had clenched in a way that made his perfectly groomed face look like something carved from marble, sharp and cold and deeply, fundamentally afraid. He'd been so focused on constructing a termination case against Ashley that he hadn't noticed that his own foundation was cracking. I'm not suggesting anything, Dr. Chen said. I'm telling you. I'm auditing every supply order you've authorized in the last 2 years. And when I'm done, the board is going to have questions. Ashley watched this play out like she was behind glass, separated from the consequence of it. The nursing director looked at her, then away. Hargrove's phone buzzed, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times. Calls coming in. The walls closing in at the speed of sound. He answered the first one with a voice that had lost its edges. No, yes, I understand. He hung up. Then the second call. Then the third. By the time he finished, something had calcified in his expression. The predator had become the hunted. He looked at Ashley one more time, and she saw the exact moment he understood that he'd miscalculated, that the invisible nurse he'd been systematically dismantling was connected to people he'd never even known existed. She saw the moment it occurred to him that you don't pick a fight with someone whose only reaction to your cruelty is stone-faced competence. You don't investigate someone whose previous employers start calling the FBI the moment they get named in a fraud case. Get out, Dr. Hargrove said. Not to Ashley. To himself. To the room. To all of it. The hallway stretched long and fluorescent as she walked out. Behind her, she could hear Dr. Chen on his phone, could hear the tone of someone reporting a crime to someone who could actually do something about it. Ahead of her, the stairs descended toward the locker room, toward a cardboard box that wouldn't need to be filled. The morning shift was starting, nurses moving through the halls like they always did, carrying their work and their secrets and their quiet, competent hands. Ashley descended toward them, her badge catching the light, her scrubs unmarked by anything except 5 years of people assuming she was just what she appeared to be. Behind her, Dr. Hargrove would spend the next 4 hours watching his career collapse in real time, each phone call a brick removed from the foundation, until by noon he would be sitting in an interrogation room explaining supply codes to federal agents who did not find his explanations interesting. But that hadn't happened yet. Right now, in this moment, she was just walking down the stairs toward her shift, and for the first time in 3 months, she was walking toward it without the weight of an invisible accusation following behind like a shadow made of teeth. The locker door opened with a creak that sounded like bones settling. Ashley stood in the pre-dawn darkness of the Oak Creek Memorial employee break room, 7:04 a.m. according to the wall clock that had been stuck at the same time for 3 months. She didn't acknowledge the other nurses who'd filed out when she walked in. Invisibility was a skill she'd mastered years before, back when it kept her alive. Now it just made the work easier. Her scrubs folded into precise thirds, military corners, muscle memory that wouldn't quit, and she laid each one in the cardboard box with the same care she'd once used packing field kits. The box was already half full. Her name badge. The trauma shears she'd carried since 2009. A surgical pen she'd stolen from the supply closet in 2015 because it was the only one that actually wrote. Small things. Personal things. Things that proved she'd existed in this place. Then she reached for the bottom shelf of her locker, where she kept the combat boots. Caked with Baghdad dust she'd never had the heart to wash away. The leather was cracked now, the left sole separating from the heel, and the right boot still held the shape of her foot from 1,000 miles of walking through a city that wanted her dead. She almost left them. Almost closed the locker and walked out with just the scrubs and the shears and let someone else decide what to do with the boots. But her hand found them anyway, and her hands had stopped asking permission about what they were allowed to hold. The boots went into the box. Heavy. Real. Proof. Security guard Webb passed her in the hallway, deliberately not looking. That was new, the not looking. For 3 months it had been the careful eye contact of someone trained to witness everything. Now he was choosing not to see her at all. She understood. Hargrove had already called him twice, probably. Already explained the situation, unstable, potentially dangerous, making accusations that could get the hospital sued. The not looking was self-preservation. She didn't fault it. The parking lot was empty at 7:15 a.m. Grey sky pressing down like a hand on her chest. She stood beside her 12-year-old Subaru, the car of someone trying not to be remembered, and set the cardboard box on the hood. The boot shifted inside. For a moment, she just looked at the box. That was her. Everything that mattered about her, now contained in something you could carry with both hands. What happened next was that she couldn't breathe properly. The realization came quietly, the way the worst truths always do. She couldn't take a full breath. Her chest felt like it was wrapped in something too tight, something that got tighter every time she tried to pull air past it. She'd learned that symptom in Baghdad. That was what it felt like when your body finally gave up keeping the score. 30 minutes later, she was sitting in the waiting room of the VA hospital, 15 minutes outside Savannah, surrounded by ghosts. The carpet was hospital beige. The chairs were the color of things that had given up. And everywhere, in the waiting room, at the check-in desk, reading magazines with dates from 2019, were the veterans she'd treated in Baghdad. Not the same men, because 5 years had passed and bodies changed and some of those men were dead. But the same haunted thing living behind their eyes. The same way they held their hands like they didn't quite trust them. The same way they flinched at the fluorescent lights. She caught her reflection in the glass partition separating the waiting room from the intake desk. For a moment, she didn't recognize herself. The woman looking back was thin in a way that wasn't discipline, it was erosion. The woman looking back had the same vacant expression as the men sitting 6 chairs away, the ones who'd stopped sleeping through the night sometime in 2004. The woman looking back was drowning in a room with 200 other people, and nobody could see it because she'd gotten very good at being invisible. That's when she understood. The waiting room wasn't what she was seeing. It was what she'd become. Just another broken soldier who couldn't outrun her ghosts, just another body waiting for someone to remember that she still existed. Her phone buzzed. A text from the hospital. Dr. Hargrove's investigation into her medication handling had been finalized. She was terminated effective immediately. All hospital property was to be returned by end of business. She understood her severance would be mailed within 10 days. She turned the phone off. The Subaru was exactly where she'd left it, the cardboard box still on the hood, the boot still shifting inside like something alive. Ashley drove with one hand and stared at the road like it was a map to somewhere that didn't exist. The hospital parking lot appeared like a punishment. Oak Creek Memorial, where she'd been so careful not to matter to anyone. That's when Jake came running. Her 16-year-old son burst through the visitor lot like something was chasing him, his backpack open, the leather strap flapping against his ribs, and in his hands, bright and awful and impossible to hide, was the shadow box. The mahogany frame catching the morning light. The medals arranged in ascending rows. The citation card visible even from 20 feet away. "Mom, they need to see these," Jake shouted, loud enough that 3 people turned to look. His voice cracked. He was holding the shadow box like it was made of glass, like it might shatter if he wasn't careful. They need to understand. Ashley's body went still in a way that had nothing to do with training. Still like a creature that's just realized the trap is closing. But her son's voice was reading from the citation card, the words coming out in that teenage breaking point way where his voice dropped an octave and came back up again. Senior Chief Petty Officer Ashley Mendez Cooper. That was the first time anyone at Oak Creek Memorial said her real name out loud. The parking lot went quiet. Actual quiet, not the busy hospital quiet of beeping monitors and nurse call buttons and the organized chaos of a morning shift change. This was the kind of quiet that happened when reality broke and nobody knew what to do with the pieces. Marcus Chen came through the glass doors still wearing his hospital gown, trembling hands holding the manila file he'd apparently demanded from records, the one labeled Nursing Staff, Personnel History. He was reading aloud as he walked, each word louder than the last, like he'd been waiting 5 years to speak these sentences. The nurse who saved my life in Baghdad. The one who carried me 3 miles through enemy fire with a collapsed lung. The one whose name I have tattooed on my left arm because I promised myself if I ever found her again, I'd make sure she knew she mattered. His gown was untied in the back. His bare feet slapped against the asphalt. His hands, steady enough to be a SEAL operator, trembling enough to be a man who'd just realized something impossible, held the proof. A man in khaki stepped forward out of the crowd that was forming now. Military bearing. The kind of posture that didn't need a uniform to announce itself. Commander Price. Ashley's former team leader from SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon. The man whose orders she'd followed for 6 years. The man who'd recommended her for early retirement with a discharge so clean it left no traces. His voice carried across the parking lot like he was addressing troops. 2 Bronze Stars with Valor, he said, each word like a hammer strike. A pause. Reaction from the crowd. Someone's breath catching audibly. Purple Heart, Price continued. His eyes were on Hargrove now, who'd come out of the hospital to see what the commotion was, whose face was going red, whose hand was reaching for his phone even though his lawyer had probably already told him not to answer anything. Another pause. A security guard moved closer, almost imperceptibly. Navy Cross, Price said, and his voice changed, dropped lower, the way it did when he was about to say something that mattered. For extracting 6 operators under fire. One of them standing right here. Marcus Chen stepped closer to Ashley. His arm extended, the tattoo in full view now, her name in military script, the letters clean, the skin around it scarred from where shrapnel had passed too close. 5 years ago, he'd survived because she'd moved fast enough. 3 nights ago, he'd survived because muscle memory never forgets how to save a life. That's when Special Agent Morrison emerged from the black SUV she'd parked at the edge of the lot, FBI credentials already displayed, her voice cutting through the morning air with the precision of someone who'd been waiting for this moment. Dr. Raymond Hargrove, I'm Special Agent Sarah Morrison with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We've had an active investigation into your billing practices for 18 months. Senior Chief Petty Officer Cooper's meticulous documentation, her photographs of the supply invoices, her copies of the device shipments, her records of what was actually received versus what was billed, provided the final evidence we needed to move forward with fraud charges. Hargrove's face went through a spectrum of colors. Red. Purple. Then ash white, the kind of white that happens when all the blood drains from a person's head at once. You have the right to remain silent, Morrison continued, but Hargrove wasn't listening. He was looking at Ashley. Really looking at her for the first time since she'd questioned an invoice 3 months ago. And what he was seeing wasn't a nurse who'd worked in his hospital. What he was seeing was someone he'd tried to destroy, someone he'd been certain was powerless, someone who'd apparently been so much more than powerless that she'd managed to break him while barely trying. The security guard, the same one who'd walked Ashley out with her cardboard box, appeared at Hargrove's shoulder 20 minutes later, after the FBI had processed his office, after his phone had been seized, after his attorney had shown up and immediately advised him to cooperate fully. The guard was carrying an identical cardboard box. Hospital issue. Brown. Empty except for whatever Hargrove managed to fit inside. Dr. Hargrove, the guard said, and his voice was something between pity and consequence, I believe you know the way out, sir. Hargrove's hands shook as he took the box. His diplomas came down from the wall in the administrator's office, they removed them for him, not letting him have the dignity of his own exit. His awards, his photographs with hospital VIPs, his nameplate that said Raymond Hargrove, MD, Chief of Surgical Services, all of it stripped bare in 15 minutes. The walk through the cardiac wing was the longest walk of his life, and every staff member standing in every doorway watched him move like a ghost trying to leave a place that no longer recognized him as real. Later that evening, the hospital board held an emergency session. They terminated his contract effective immediately. They reported him to the state medical board. They contacted his malpractice insurance company, who immediately began calculating their exposure. The news crews had already gotten wind of it. Navy hero working incognito at Savannah Hospital uncovers major fraud, and the story was spreading through local outlets like truth moving at the speed of light. Morrison held a press conference at 4 p.m. detailing 18 months of inflated billing codes, kickbacks totaling $340,000, documentation destruction, and systematic fraud. Hargrove's attorney released a statement denying everything, but the evidence was already public. The evidence was in Ashley's handwriting. The evidence was in her photographs. The evidence was in the meticulous record-keeping of a woman who'd learned in Baghdad that details save lives. 2 years later, the story had a different ending. The Oak Creek Memorial Cardiac Wing was renamed the Senior Chief Mendez Cooper Veteran Care Center. Ashley walked its halls in different scrubs now, Director of Trauma Nursing, VA Regional Program. She'd integrated her past and her present into something that could actually hold them both. She ran workshops on combat medicine for civilian nurses. She facilitated PTSD support groups for veteran healthcare workers. She'd finally learned that healing wasn't about becoming invisible. It was about being seen and choosing to stay standing anyway. Marcus Chen appeared at her office door for their weekly lunch, rolling up his sleeve out of habit now, the tattoo a bridge between who she was and who she'd become. The shadow box hung on her wall beside her nursing credentials, no longer hidden but displayed where anyone who entered could see it. And Dr. Hargrove? He was teaching CPR at Savannah Community College for $15.85 an hour, the job that nobody else wanted, the position that nobody else could get hired for. His medical license was revoked. His reputation was destroyed. His calls to appeal his suspension were denied systematically. Not all heroes wear capes, some wear scrubs. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below. Have you ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong?